Okay, good morning, everybody. Fingers crossed you can see me and hear me. And you should also be able to see a slide on your screen. If you could just all use your raise hand function, let me know you're all there okay. It's very difficult when you're hosting online to... Perfect, thank you. That's absolutely brilliant. Everyone's very apt at these online sessions now. Brilliant, lovely to see you all there. I've got a great turnout today and we have a fantastic panel of speakers for you today. So I'm just going to do a little bit of quick housekeeping, just the boring stuff, and then I'm going to hand over to Jo Overty from Biosphere. So just to let you know, this session is being recorded. It's only being recorded for sharing purposes amongst this group here, and Chamber will pop it on our YouTube page, and I'll share the link with you once the session's over. You can then share this among your colleagues, and it's just really handy to rewatch if you want to go over anything again. If just for those who aren't familiar with using online Zoom webinars, you are all muted with your cameras off, so don't worry about that. We use the chat function, and we can also use the Q&A function as well. So as we move along the session, you'll be able to use those two areas to chat amongst yourselves, and if you have any questions, pop them in the Q&A box. Fingers crossed, all going well, we will be splitting you into breakout groups as well. So at some point that will happen, but don't worry, we'll let you know when we do that. Please allow just a few seconds when we hand over videos to each of the panelists. Sometimes there's a little bit of a delay. So without further ado, I am going to hand you over to Jo Overty, who's going to do a quick introduction, and then we will bring in Fiona.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this sixth and final session of our Sustainable Man workshops run by UNESCO Biosphere Isle of Man in conjunction with the Chamber of Commerce, UCM, One World Centre and the Department for Enterprise. It's great to see some new faces today, but also fantastic to see so many familiar faces from the previous 5 workshops staying with us. These sessions are delivered under our strategy Working Together for a Sustainable Future. As businesses, you heat and light premises, you travel, you manufacture, you consume, you package, you transport, and you create waste. So this is decisions you make and the actions you take have potential to have a really significant positive impact on our biosphere and on our planet. So far, we've enjoyed sessions on starting up sustainably, recycling, energy, circular economy, and attracting nature and wildlife. Today, with COP26 on the go, just 113 miles away in Glasgow, the topic of climate change on absolutely everybody's lips, we turn to that. Today's session will be led by Dr. Fiona Gell, who's Head of Research and Development in the Isle of Man Government Climate Change Transformation Team, and Alex Massey from Eunomia Research and Consultation. Fiona is leading the climate change planning work, the development and implementation of the climate change bill in the Isle of Man, and is lead officer on nature-based solutions for climate change. She's worked for the Isle of Man government for 15 years, much of that time on marine science, marine conservation, and more recently in ecosystem policy. And she was seconded to the climate change emergency work in 2019. She has a PhD in seagrass ecology, and she's currently completing an MSc in carbon management. Alex is Eunomia's lead on climate change emergency work. With a background in engineering and education, he's led work to develop plans for net zero with local and national governments, businesses and charities since the beginning of the net zero movement in 2019. This work has included approaches to decarbonising entire organisations, a £1 billion investment portfolio, and indeed entire cities. He has also led work examining the reality of carbon offsets and what this means for organisations like yours seeking to do their bit and to reach net zero. As Rebecca has said, the session will be interactive, and let's hope we have some fun along the way too. So I'll now hand over to Dr. Fiona Gell. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you can all hear me okay. And you can still see the slide. It's really nice to be able to join you virtually today and to join this what looks like it's been a brilliant course of lectures, the Sustainable Man series. So sorry about that, was a bit of a delay with the slides going forward. The structure of the session, first of all, I'm going to do quite a brief introduction on the Isle of Man context around climate change. And then I'm going to be handing over to Alex, who, as Jo said, works for Eunomia, who have helped us in the first phase of our climate change work in 2019 and are now back assisting us on some of the technical aspects of the work that we're doing at the moment. And we're very pleased that Alex and Laura are able to help us today. So Alex will give you a much more detailed overview of the role that businesses can play in climate action and opportunities for mitigation adaptation. And then we wanted to do something a bit more interactive in this session, and because there's such a great mix of different businesses and perspectives in the group, use some group discussions about how we can create a positive culture for climate and environmental action within your organisations and also more generally across the island. Then there'll be feedback from the groups, and then just a few words at the end to close. And there will be opportunities for questions as well at various points. So I know a lot of you will be very aware of what's happened with the climate change work in the Isle of Man, but for those of you who might not be so up to date, I'm just going to give a very brief overview. So there'd been obviously various work over the years on climate action and how we reduce the greenhouse gas emissions of the Isle of Man, but it was really in 2019 when the previous Chief Minister, Howard Quayle, officially recognised the climate emergency, so that was in May 2019, and made a commitment for the Isle of Man to reach net zero by 2050, and also for the introduction of a climate change bill. And then a subsequent motion in Tynwald led to the appointment of James Curran, an independent chair of a newly formed Climate Change Transformation Board, to write a report on how the Isle of Man could achieve net zero. So there was a very quick reaction through that Tynwald motion to the Chief Minister's declaration recognition of the climate emergency. And the work that was done by James Curran, which you can find online, and it was he did a very comprehensive report, and that was supported by, I think it's around about 30 technical annexes, which were produced by the Climate Change Analytical Team, which was made up of officers from across government to support James Curran's work. That then informed the Council of Ministers Phase 1 Climate Action Plan, which was agreed unanimously in Tynwald in January 2020. So this is a slide that's been borrowed from my colleague Ali, who's leading on the delivery side of things. So it's just to kind of give you a bit of an overview of what's happened since then. So just some of the highlights. So after the full support of the Climate Action Plan in January 2020, there was £10 million committed to climate action, and also once the Climate Action Plan was agreed, the Climate Change Bill work could start in earnest in terms of developing that Climate Change Bill that the Chief Minister had committed to earlier in 2019. And then in March, there was the climate team to deliver the Climate Action Plan was due to form, but the COVID intervened, and so there was a slight delay with that. And then in September 2020, the Climate Change team was established, and that coincided with there was consultation over that summer on the Climate Change Bill, and then that was completed in September. And the Citizens Forum, which some of you potentially been involved in, that was formed in October 2020, and the work began in earnest on the 60 actions that are outlined in the Climate Change Plan. Some of the really key work, obviously, around transitioning the Isle of Man to net zero is around how we generate our electricity. And so a big piece of work began in November 2020 around the future energy scenario work. So that work was commissioned. And also in November 2020, the Climate Change Bill had its first reading. Since then, there's been a lot more work around community engagement and building links with it across the government. So I should have mentioned that originally the climate change work was part of the Department of Environment, Food and Agriculture and DEFRA, but it's now moved into Cabinet Office, so it's in the centre of government. And there's some of the actions which again you can find about on the website include delivering peatland restoration. There's obviously the People's Wood that many of you will have heard of, that links again directly into the former Chief Minister's commitments on climate change, and February 2021, the Climate Change Bill got its second and third readings. And this year, so since March 2021, one of the other things that's been going on that you might have heard about is the liaison with the UK around the extension of the ratification of the Paris Agreement, which has been going on with the UK government, and the continuation of the Climate Change Bill through the legislative process. In June, the Climate Change Bill went to the UK for royal assent, and so we're waiting for that to be finally sort of signed off, and then it will hopefully be, come into action. We're hoping sometime this month. So that's kind of imminent. Some of you might have been aware of the consultation, and so there was lots of public engagement around that. There's work now underway on renewable heating strategy, so that's looking at how we can reduce the emissions that are associated with heating our homes, which is a really big category of emissions. Again, we'll talk a bit more about that later on. And yeah, there's exactly our greenhouse gas emissions come from, and this is recorded every year and verified by the UK, and it goes into the UK's total national inventory. And the one on the left hand side of the screen is the Isle of Man, so you can see that between 1990 and 2019 there has actually been a slight increase in our emissions, whereas if you look at the UK's inventory on the right, you can see that they have since 1990 have had a quite steady decrease in their emissions, and that's been largely due to their transition away from fossil fuel electricity generation. So I think that highlights quite clearly how we've got a lot to do in terms of getting to net zero and making those changes, but we're well, the work that's underway at the moment, particularly on the electricity generation, we're much closer to setting that path, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. And again, all this information is available on the website if you want to look a bit more into what exactly those emissions are and where they come from. A really important part of the work that we've been doing over the past 2 years is around the Climate Change Bill, and that was what the Chief Minister made a commitment to in 2019. It's gone completely through the TIML process, but it just needs the royal assent from the UK. When it comes in, there will be a legal requirement for a 5-year climate change plan to be approved by TIML by April 2022, and then for one of those plans to be in place at all times. And we also have a commitment to agree an interim target by April 2022. And it sets a really clear process for agreeing plans and then reporting on them. So it sets a really high level of accountability in how we plan for reducing our emissions and how we deliver that planning as well. It also sets a duty for all public bodies to be delivering on net zero. And again, you can find more information about this on our website, but there's it really does underpin everything that we do across the government and across public bodies in terms of needing to make sure that we fully consider the climate change impacts, and also that we consider just transition, how the work that we do to reduce emissions impacts on our community and perhaps the most vulnerable people. And also it provides a statutory duty to protect ecosystems and biodiversity. So there's a whole range of provisions that will hopefully really change the way that we approach decision making around climate and the environment. In terms of the climate change plan, the plan that will come in next year will be the first legally binding climate change plan. And so we wanted to set a good precedent in terms of the content. It's going to be evidence-based and work like the future energy scenario work is feeding into that. And it needs to be ambitious and address difficult issues that perhaps we haven't been able to address to date. And there's the opportunity to rapidly progress on no regret decisions. So the things that will definitely have a good outcome for climate and also for the wider community. So yeah, that's and again, you can find more about that. I can point people in the direction of more information about that. And the interim target as well, that's a really important, the interim target is setting a date between now and 2050 and a target for the emissions reduction by then, so that we set a kind of a pathway and a 2030 target feels a lot more kind of real and something that we can be working towards now than perhaps 2050 target, which, you know, can be quite easy to think, well, you know, it's such a long way off. So that it's likely to be a 2030 target. So I've gone through that very, very quickly, but the Isle of Man has made some really big steps forward in the last couple of years in responding to the climate emergency, and we have a lot more to do, and we're very conscious of how much we do have to do. But one of the key themes throughout this work is that we need to work together to achieve net zero, that it's something that we have to do collaboratively. There's a lot that government has to do, and there's also a lot that we can across the community do together. So it's brilliant that you've done, you know, all the previous lectures, that everything that you've been learning about for your businesses are so important for climate change and for the wider environment, and there is such a lot you can do. So on that note, I will hand over to Alex to talk about exactly what you can do.
Thank you, Fiona, and thank you, Joe, for the introduction earlier. Hello, everybody. Good morning. I do hope you're doing well. It's a pleasure to virtually be here. Sadly, not in person this time, but it's good to be able to speak with you and hopefully be able to have a good conversation with you in a little bit. I'm going to start by running through some of the basics on climate change. We're going to start pretty simple. We're going to get steadily more complicated and into some really knotty questions. So some of you, I'm sure, are very well versed in this. So apologies if it is very, very familiar to you. But I just want to make sure that everybody has at least the same starting point for the discussions later, which are definitely going to be issues which everybody needs to get their teeth into. Very quick bit of housekeeping before I get stuck in. We've got an allocated time for some Q&A at the end. So I'll talk through these. If you have questions you want that are burning as you go, please use the Q&A function. My colleague Laura will monitor that. If we can answer it in the moment, we will do so. Otherwise, we'll ask you to ask your question once we get to the Q&A section later. So yeah, please do stick questions in there if you have them. Okay, so climate change. I would like to think that everybody's reasonably well aware of what we're talking about here. Fundamentally, increasing temperatures due to greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. There are two elements to acting or preparing for or trying to deal with climate change. One is called mitigation, and that is action to try and reduce the amount of emissions being put into the atmosphere, or even start to remove emissions from the atmosphere to try and make the problem less big, as it were, using very, very simple language. But there's also a second strand, and that's adaptation. So that's preparing for the changes that have already happened and are coming. So on the right, you can see a building that's designed for in anticipation of flooding, which is something that is being seen much more of at the moment. We're going to focus primarily on mitigation today. We will touch on adaptation a little bit, but the focus at COP is also very much on how can we try and make sure the problem does not get any bigger than it already is locked in to be. So we'll start on mitigation and move on to adaptation. So I mentioned briefly rising temperatures due to increased greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So we've got a diagram showing the one that you've probably seen a version of before, showing just how rapidly things have increased. So 1 degree difference between about 100 years ago and now doesn't feel like an awful lot, but the sensitivity of the Earth's ecosystems to temperature fluctuations means that this is really dramatic, in particular just how quickly the changes have taken place. And as you can see, most of that really is in the latter parts, a good 100 years or so after the invention of the steam engine in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So it's a very short-term issue, but it's already having very big impacts. So what impact that's going to have really depends on how much greenhouse gas we decide we're going to continue to put into the atmosphere. the Committee on Climate Change, also the International Panel on Climate Change, and various other bodies do run forecasts on what things might look like. We've got a more optimistic scenario at the top, which sees significant reductions in emissions from now onwards, showing sort of a gentle, maybe 1.5, 2 degree, maybe up to 3 degree warming in the North Pole as almost a best case scenario. And that's by the end of the century. So that's sort of what we're looking at optimistically. 1.5 to 2 degrees in some parts of the world is still really very dramatic in terms of its impact on ecosystems and the cycles of weather and various other cycles. So that would still have dramatic impact. The lower one, however, is obviously much more intense, showing what would happen if we basically continue broadly along the same path that we're going, which is continuing industrialization, continuing burning of fossil fuels without much restraint. And there we're talking about runaway climate change, dramatic temperature increases across the course of the century, which is really not worth thinking about. So, of course, there is action. Most of you, if not all of you, will be aware that we have COP26 going on. Probably you'll have heard of the Paris Agreement from 2015. There have been all sorts of things to try and reduce the emissions that we as a species are putting into the atmosphere. At the moment, there are all sorts of charts on this, lots of lines on this, lots of different scenarios. Fundamentally, we're on the orange line, the one that's sort of steadily, still very slightly going up from 2020 onwards. We're continuing to increase. That's despite all of the agreements we've had previously. The grey line is the one that has been identified as a 1.5 degree warming scenario. Now, 1.5 degrees is seen as the very, very best scenario that we can achieve. That's still, for some communities and some ecosystems, really, really dangerous. But overall, it's felt that we can probably deal with that. As you can see, we're way off course from that already. We continue to go along the orange, and that makes it even harder to get down onto the grey. But that's what COP26 is about. That's what's going on right now, is can we move ourselves from that orange line more towards that grey line? And that's obviously huge amounts of responsibility on governments, but there is an opportunity for every organisation to play their part. So not all emissions are equal as far as an organisation will be concerned. And that's because there are lots of different sources of emissions. There are also lots of different types of greenhouse gases. So everybody will have heard of carbon dioxide, but there are also other emissions such as methane. That's probably another one that you've heard, nitrous oxide, HFCs, refrigerants, etc. Most of the global heating that is taking place has been due to carbon dioxide emitted as a result of burning fossil fuels, but that's not all of it. And some gases have a much more potent impact in the short term, such as methane, which over the course of about the first 10 years of being in the atmosphere is 80 to 120 times as powerful as carbon dioxide. So we're not just talking carbon dioxide, though in many cases that will be the primary gas. So in order to try and get to grips with what you are emitting as an organization, there is a system called the scope system, and there are 3 scopes in that. In the middle, you'll see scope 1, and that's talking about what are called direct emissions. So these are emissions that are created by your activities. So whether that's burning gas in a boiler to heat your offices, or a company-owned car that's being driven around, or van that's being driven around for work purposes. Those are all emissions from equipment that you own or you operate, and that's classified as your scope 1. You have complete control over that, and that's something that is usually you'll have a reasonable visibility of. On the left-hand side, you'll see scope 2. So this is where the greenhouse gas is emitted somewhere else to produce electricity that you use. So usually this is pretty easily quantifiable in terms of, we know how much greenhouse gas is emitted for a kilowatt hour. You'll know how many kilowatt hours you consume. So generally you will then have a relationship between the amount of electricity you consume and what the emissions are. There are, of course, some green tariffs out there. We'll talk about those things a little bit later, but fundamentally Scope 2 is all about electricity produced elsewhere for you to use. And then the really knotty one is the one on the right, Scope 3, really very much indirect emissions. And these are the emissions that are associated with all sorts of activities and your business or organization. So all the waste that you produce, the disposal of that, whether it's incinerated or recycled or landfilled, the emissions associated with that are part of what's called your Scope 3 emissions. Similarly, all the emissions that go into making the equipment that you use are included in your Scope 3 emissions. And you'll see a number of other different items in there. There are hundreds of things that fall into that category. It's usually very big, and it's also much harder to have a real handle on controlling it. So bear those in mind as we go forward. So I'll start with Scope 1 and 2 sources. I've touched on them. You see some electricity pylons there. We've talked about vehicles, briefly in terms of internal combustion engines in vehicles you might operate, buildings, heating buildings. What I've not touched on is emissions from land use. So soil erosion or farming and certain farming practices or other land use practices will emit greenhouse gases as well. All of these sources, if you own the equipment or you own the land, those are Scope 1 sources for you, and if you're buying the electricity, they're Scope 2 sources. In terms of addressing these, I'm not going to go through every single thing you could possibly do. I'm going to give you an example, and we're going to look at the transport hierarchy as a good, or the travel hierarchy as a good way of dealing with it. Fundamentally, the principle around trying to address these things is, can you do less of it in the first place? That's not always going to be the case, but I'm just going to use travel as an example of that. So if you can use the phone, can you video conference rather than having to travel to do something, the emissions associated with that are very much lower. So if you can avoid traveling, lower emissions. You then have cycling and walking, very, very low emissions. You've probably got the equipment, maintaining the equipment, etc., but there's pretty much nothing there, obviously not really much of a problem. As you go down the travel hierarchy, you gradually go up in emissions. And so the idea is to try and move up this hierarchy as much as you can. You won't always be able to get everything into the very top categories. There will be times when you absolutely have to do something which takes your staff members out and about. Maybe that's because of home visits for healthcare, for example. You're going to have a vehicle to achieve that. But can you move it from the more polluting to the less polluting? And you can apply this kind of principle to all kinds of emissions, whether that's heating buildings, where can you insulate your building to reduce the amount you need to use in the first place, and then think about replacing your heating system so it's lower carbon, etc. But fundamentally, can you just find a way to do less of it in the first place? Scope 3. I touched on, there's waste as a major source of emissions, but there's also all the equipment that you might purchase. These are much harder in terms of a rule of thumb of what you need to do. Fundamentally, this is about engaging with suppliers, whether that's supplier of waste services to you or suppliers of equipment, etc. There's also, of course, your employees' commutes and all sorts of other things that land in there. But in these, Scope 3, you're much more reliant on negotiation with other organizations. And this is much more challenging to achieve, because whilst you might have the leverage of, right, we might take our business elsewhere, that you cannot force a supplier into it, and you may have a contract for some while, for example, for waste for 5 years, etc. So that could be a limiting factor that you'll have to work through or around. So what can you do? Fundamentally, I would say you've probably got a 5-stage process that you need to go through. Many of you will be well through this already, and great if you have done so. Some of you will only just be at the beginning, and that's absolutely fine. The nature of running a business is you've got an awful lot on your plate, and finding time to think about these things can be challenging. So the first thing to do is to understand the challenge. What is the scale of the challenge for you as a business, as an organization, and what does it look like broadly you're going to need to do? From that, you can start to build an action plan. How can we get from where we are to where we want to go, and what are the steps we're going to need to take? Probably not understanding all of them right now, but definitely some of the immediate ones and key decisions that you'll need to take further down the line. You then may wish to set yourself some targets to try and guide your progress. Not everybody will want to, but it can really focus the mind. But the next thing you definitely will want to do is monitor how you're going. How are things, how are the changes going? Are you on track, or are things working as you hoped? And you may wish to report. We'll talk a little bit about that later. So we're going to go through each of these in turn. So understanding the challenge. The first thing that you'll need to work out is what's actually going on in terms of emissions. Many of you will already understand that. Some of you will not yet do so. Part of that will mean deciding what emissions are you interested in. There is not a requirement on you in any form to report all of Scope 3 emissions. And in fact, if you're a smaller in the Isle of Man, there's no obligation for particular reporting at the moment anyway. But you'll have to decide which emissions you want to address. The more ambitious organizations that want to try and take it, have the biggest impact, will generally draw the widest possible dotted line that they can around all the emission sources. Some will feel that it really is out of their control, certain emission sources, and may choose to draw their line more narrowly. That reduces the amount you can have an impact, and ultimately what we're trying to do here is maximize the impact of reducing emissions. But there is of course a legitimate argument that if you don't have control, you might not want to be planning to try and address that. So it's an important question to ask yourselves: where are you drawing that dotted line? What are you including? So what is included is important, but also what are the sources of those emissions? You might have an understanding of, well, we use this much fuel in our vehicles, so that must lead to those that many emissions. But what you really need to understand in order to make change is, well, what are the vehicles we've got? What are the engines? And what are the changes going to be that need to be made? Similarly on heating, you might know how much oil you consume for your heating, but you need to, in order to really understand the actions you can take, you need to know what's the equipment that's burning that oil. And then the other thing in terms of understanding understanding the challenge is understanding, how much you might be able to measure things. So you might want to include stuff that you're only confident on measuring. I sort of touched on this beforehand, but you might be willing and you might want to measure really precisely, and that might be your choice. You really want to measure precisely, but you might decide that actually, okay, I've got a good idea, but not a perfect idea, and that's good enough. So you've got to make a decision: how accurate do you want to be in order to guide your action? And the answer is, you can never get complete perfect accuracy, and that's not the end of the world. But there will be a level that you'll be comfortable with, and you need to understand what level of accuracy of understanding of the emissions works for you. So once you've understood the scale of the issue and what you're comfortable in terms of including and trying to address, you'll want to build a roadmap. So you'll probably come up with all sorts of different lines. We've got a few random examples on your left. They're not indicative of anything in particular. They're just example lines. So we've got one highlighted in orange that we're going to have a quick look at. And we've got 3 points along this. Now, building the action plan will have many more than 3 actions in there, but here we've got 3 example actions. You might be changing a supplier, you might manage to decarbonize your production process, and you might educate your customers to use things in a different way, all sorts of different actions. Some of your actions might be, at this point in time, we're going to make a decision on whether we're going to go down the route of technology 1 or technology 2, but we're going to wait until that point so we have all the evidence that we need. So there are all sorts of things that you might build in there, not just actions that will immediately remove emissions. Some actions you'll need to take won't actually remove emissions at all. They might increase emissions in the short term, but what they do is pave the way for massive reduction in emissions further down the line. So be prepared to have some preparatory actions in there. So the other thing you might want to think about is targets. And we've heard net zero talked about quite a bit. You'll probably hear it everywhere at the moment. But net zero is not the only target you might consider. It's being widely used in a number of different ways. Fundamentally, there is gradually becoming agreement around what it will mean. Science-based targets is probably the most authoritative definition of this. And fundamentally, what net zero is talking about is whatever emissions you still have, minus greenhouse gas removals that you're achieving. So that's taking greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, say from trees, or maybe in the future that's carbon capture and storage. If what you're taking out of the atmosphere, you're responsible for taking out of the atmosphere, is more or the same as what you're putting into the atmosphere, then you've reached net zero. Now there are further limitations on that, but that's fundamentally the definition that looks like it's emerging. There is another definition called climate positive, and that starts as the same. So what are you still emitting into the atmosphere minus whatever you're taking out of the atmosphere, but also minus greenhouse gas reduction offsets that you're paying for somebody else somewhere to reduce emissions that instead of yourself. So climate positive is another definition that allows you to offset by paying for somebody else to reduce their emissions instead. That one carries much less weight than net zero, but it might be, just wanted you to be aware that it exists. It is not likely to become very common, but it is part of the science-based targets definitions as well. And then you might have also heard about another definition of zero carbon, and that's very simple. That is zero emissions in total. Now that may not be achievable at all. Some organizations have declared that they will meet zero carbon. Obviously, they're much less likely to be heavy industry or agricultural organizations where emissions are almost built into certain activities. But I wanted again to flag that to you. So there are other definitions as well. There's climate neutral, which is not pinned down at all. All sorts of things. And I would definitely urge you to spend a bit of time thinking about what target, if you're going to set one, you are actually setting and what it means for you. There are organizations out there that jumped 2 years ago or so declaring something without really understanding what it was, and are now possibly having to climb down from it, or in one form or another, which is obviously not where anybody wants to get to. At the same time, you probably want to be setting a target that really is as ambitious as you feel comfortable with, to give you the chance of having the maximum impact. And then the final thing I wanted to flag is what timing for your target. 2030 is a very common target that you'll hear about. 2030 is clearly highly ambitious for some organizations. For other organizations that maybe have very minimal emissions, it can be really quite easily achievable. That's something you would have to grapple with. What I do want to flag about 2030 is I would just ask you to think very seriously about, does this feel right? there are actually ways in which a 2030 target could create more emissions than if you did a slightly later target. For example, if you've just bought a whole new fleet of vehicles, which might have a standard life of 12, 14 years for you. I'm just plucking numbers out of the air. You probably wouldn't do that much usually, but you would expect them to go that long before renewal. And then you suddenly replace them in 2 years' time with a new fleet of electric vehicles. There are all the emissions associated with making those new vehicles, which wouldn't have otherwise been purchased. So actually, that elimination of existing equipment that was perfectly good for new equipment that has a high emissions tag on its production could actually drive up emissions. That doesn't mean, oh, well, we should push everything back to 2050 and then we don't, and that's actually lower emissions. That's not the case. But there are scenarios in which you can push yourself hard and actually, as a result, probably lead to a slightly worse outcome. So you need to have a look at what you're doing and really feel your way into what overall makes sense in terms of making change at an appropriate time that minimizes emissions overall. And that's what we're aiming for, minimal emissions overall. And then one thing, and I touched on, that you definitely will want to do is monitoring progress. Monitoring progress can, I think, it sort of linked to what I was saying earlier, that you don't have, you're never going to get perfect visibility of your emissions. Well, you're never going to get perfect monitoring of your progress. You've got to work out what is the right level of detail for you to monitor progress. Now, if you've got relatively few emissions, then it's probably going to be pretty simple. But one of the temptations in monitoring progress is just monitoring the emissions themselves. What I would often strongly argue for is not just monitoring the emissions themselves, but monitoring the sources of the emissions and the activities that you're taking. So if you know that you've replaced you've got 10 oil boilers, and in 3 years' time you've managed to replace 5 with heat pump systems, you know that you have gone that substantial distance towards reducing your emissions. You're 50% of the way there on your actions that you need to take. That's also a really important monitoring approach. Of course, monitoring the emissions themselves is also important, particularly if you want to do some reporting, which is the next piece that I want to talk to. So reporting, you are, at the moment, it is very unlikely, unless you set your own obligation on yourself to report. There is no necessity to report what your emissions are, definitely not for smaller businesses. But it's something that businesses are beginning, or organizations are beginning to consider. And the reason is that as bigger organizations become more and more concerned about their scope 3 emissions, so what's up and down their supply chain, they're asking, okay, what are your emissions? What are the emissions associated with your products, your services? Because we're going to account for that. And so having something that you can share with, well, this is what we've done and this is where we're going, can really help that. It's not currently a gateway for organizations to do big business with bigger organizations, but we're beginning to see requirements for at least proof of net zero plans for in some sectors. And this is probably likely to continue to emerge over time. So it's something that's going to be really important to consider. Do you want to report? Do you need to report? Do you need to report now? Probably not. Might you need to report in 2 or 3 years' time? You might need to. There are multiple different standards for reporting. We've got a couple here. We've got greenhouse gas protocol is just one that's up there. There are a number of others, and you might decide to report according to the ones that are most appropriate to the targets that you've set. But I would definitely suggest having a look at what there is, maybe seeking a bit of advice on what might be appropriate for you, maybe from your own trade body or similar, who can maybe point you in the right direction for your kind of business. So I would definitely ask you, just even if it's not the right time to report now, you might want something internally, and you might want to just keep an eye on, will we need to report in future in order to enable ourselves to keep going in business. So that was a quick run through mitigation. Very quickly on adaptation. Adaptation, as I said, is preparing for the changes that have, some of which have already happened and are just going to get bigger, such as extreme weather events, and some of which are probably on the horizon but not yet here. So I'm just going to run through very quickly. We've got put a few images. So on the top left, we can obviously see flooding. That's one example of more extreme weather. That's sort of a secondary impact of the rising temperatures. On the top right, we've got an image representing migratory pressures. That can be both really big scale international changes, but it also can be much more local, as people just seek to move out of the areas that are flooding much more regularly. So it can be micro within a community, all sorts of changes in where people want or are able to live. Lower, you've got rising sea levels, but there are things not pictured here, and probably one of the biggest ones is supply chain disruption. So with extreme weather events, or with failing crops, or with all sorts of different dynamics going on around the world, are incredibly long supply chains, which are very finely tuned, are potentially under could potentially receive severe disruption. And that is probably one of the adaptation issues that you'll want to think about most. What parts of my supply chain are potentially at risk from significant climate change, not necessarily on the Isle of Man or even in neighbouring countries, UK, Ireland, but globally. What could be at risk, and how do we prepare for that, even if you're not yourselves at risk of flooding at the moment or of sea level rise? So there are sort of primary impacts such as sea level rise or flooding, and secondary ones such as the knock-on impact through supply chain impact or migration, etc. So we've talked about mitigation and adaptation. We're going to go into the Q&A very shortly, but I just wanted to talk briefly about actually making the change happen. So we've got some heat pumps in front of us again, and this is to illustrate technology. The technology already exists. Heat pumps, as an example, are a technology that are decades old, widely used in other countries. Some of the first vehicles were actually electric cars rather than internal combustion engine cars. Obviously, we've refined them significantly since then. But a lot of the technologies we need are long, and the principles we need are long-standing. If the money's available, the technology fundamentally exists for us to do things much better. So the technology part is actually reasonably easy, but it's not the only part in making change. What you can see in front of you now is from the Committee on Climate Change, and it's an estimated role of different types of changes that are needed to meet net zero targets. So basically, the red is your technological only proportion of how much that contributes to the change. They've only got 9% there. The grey is measures that combine low carbon technology and societal behaviour change. So that's about 38%. But their estimate is over half of the change that is needed to achieve what we need to achieve is societal or behavioural changes. It's a change in culture, because ultimately our culture drives our decision making. It's at the root of whether a technological change is lasting or not. And so this really leads into the section we're going to follow on from this, which is to explore how can we make the cultural change that means that we get lasting improvements in this area. And that's something that is relevant to every organisation and every community on the Isle of Man, across the UK, across Western Europe, Eastern Europe, across the globe. And it's a challenge that we've not cracked, and one that I hope we can really get stuck into, and hopefully many of you have been grappling with, and we can share some of your learning from that. So having gone through all of these things, we focused a lot on the technical parts. Please bear in mind, actually the biggest part is the softer stuff, and it's probably the biggest challenge that we face. So that was my brief tour. I hope some of it was engaging for those of you who were well acquainted with the information. So I've not been monitoring the questions. I hope, I'm not sure whether Laura or any of the team have done so, but we've got 10 minutes now for Q&A. So I'm not sure who can curate, Laura, but I'm ready to go.
Hi, Alex. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having us. I'm a junior consultant. I also work at Eunomia with Alex. Alex, we've had no questions so far, so I'll open the floor. Rebecca, if you're able to unmute everybody, that would be great so that people are able to ask their questions. I'll leave it to you.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Alex. Just clicking allow to talk to everyone. So everyone, you now have the opportunity to unmute your microphones. If you're feeling shy, then you can, of course, pop something in the Q&A box or the chat box.
So it's absolutely fine if there are no questions. It either means I've put everybody to sleep with my presentation, or everything is currently clear.
We've received a question, Alex. The question is, can we expand on the dotted line, what should be within and outside of it? I'll bring up the slide and we can talk about how you might make the decision about that.
That's a very good question.
Well, there it is.
There we go. We've got a dotted line to look at. Okay, so there are, I was about to say there are no hard and fast rules. I think you are definitely going to be including your scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. So those are emissions that from what you're burning on your site or in your vehicles and the electricity you're purchasing. Those are required from pretty much every reporting approach that there is, and you have control over them. You can control what tariff you're on, you can control what equipment that you have in your buildings, etc., to an extent, but those will definitely be within your dotted line. Outside of your so what might fall inside or outside of your dotted line it's that question over these scope 3 emissions. So a lot of organizations will consider the control that they might have over their emissions. So they might decide that they, because of the waste, the way that their waste is dealt with, they have a contract with the waste company and they have choice over it. So then we can choose to go with a waste company which will reduce emissions, so we should include that. It might be that you don't have any choice over that whatsoever, And you might decide, well, we'll keep monitoring it and we'll keep asking that company how they're doing, but we're not going, so we might mention it, but we're not going to include it in our target because we don't have control. Some organizations might still, even if they don't have very much control, decide, but we still want to include it because we want to be seen to be doing, or we want to be seen to be accounting for every single possible emission. So we're working with one organization which has quite a large property portfolio, which is basically their investment portfolio. And they own the land, but everything else is leased out on very long-term leases. And those leases give them zero control over what's done on the land, what emissions are created from those buildings. Ultimately, that organization has decided, even though they have pretty much zero control, because they're high profile, they want to include those in their dotted line because they don't want to be called out for, but you own this and you've not said anything about it. So they've taken that from a decision from a reputational point of view to do that. Although on a control basis, they can do pretty much nothing to affect that. So there are some questions there around what might be publicly acceptable as far as you're concerned in your reputation, what might be acceptable to you in terms of where do we want to draw the line in terms of control. The final example on control might be you're locked into a contract for a number of years, but you know you'll be able to, you've got a chance of potentially renegotiating it slightly for the next 5 years. And then after 5 years, you can completely retender. So you've got not very much control right now, but you're going to have control significantly in the future. You're probably going to want to include that because you will have control even if you don't now. But navigating it it can be pretty tricky, all of those scope 3 things, because there are so many different bits to it. But scope 1 and 2 definitely in. And then scope 3, I would say fundamentally think about 2 things: your control and what you think publicly you need to be doing or to be seen to be doing. Okay, we have another question.
Yes. What are the most effective things anyone could do today to move to net zero?
The most effective things that you can do to move towards net zero. So ultimately, net zero is a state, as I said, of balancing that equation. So it's going to take you long. The most difficult bits are going to be the things that limit how quickly you can get to net zero. So actually, I would say the quickest thing, the most important thing you can do to get there as quickly as possible is identify the most difficult parts of your emissions. Now work out what you can start to do to begin to make progress on those difficult things, because starting now means you can finish sooner. There are quick wins that you can make on certain things, such as your electricity well, for some organizations, I know it's different on MAN, so I'm not going to use the electricity tariff example, but in terms of if you've got a vehicle and you can afford it, you could switch to electric and that would reduce your emissions immediately, or you could go from using a vehicle to cycling. That would again reduce your emissions immediately. But achieving net zero sooner, as soon as possible, is fundamentally find the most difficult things and see what you can start in progress.
We have another question in the chat, but it looks like Fiona has her hand up.
Yeah, it was just to add to Alex's reply to that question about what one thing you can do. And I think just another thing that, hopefully we'll be touching on later on with the culture change discussion is just, I think, talk about climate change. I think that's, that conversation, and that's what my colleagues with all the activities that are going on this week around COP26 and all the lots of different activities in the community and online, having that conversation, if we're all talking about climate change a lot more than, you know, in your organisation at home, I think that would be my kind of top thing that everyone could do now as well. So
great, thank you, Fiona. I see if we got another one.
Our next question, yes. Where do you see formal environmental management systems such as ISO 14001, it's been noted, falling into this? Are they a useful mechanism?
So I see ISO 14001 as an example of environmental management system is useful. Yes, we ourselves are ISO 14001 accredited because it does two things. One, it allows us to show that we're taking it seriously, and that is important. But perhaps more importantly than all of that is we're audited on it every year, and that means that we make sure that we maintain our environmental management systems properly, that we ensure that the processes are there and doing what they're meant to and continually improve them. That external check on us is really, really powerful. I'm not saying we're an environmental consultancy, so we'd be taking it incredibly seriously regardless, but there is a real benefit to having external scrutiny to say, yep, that is really good, but also bit of learning from elsewhere. You could consider doing this or improve on that. So your environmental management system is probably going to be an important part of the day-to-day actions in your organization, which will take you down to whatever your emissions target is, because it's about embedding it in daily or weekly or monthly or board level decision making. So I'd say they're very important tools. They're not an exciting tool, but they're important.
Super, thanks, Alex. We have a question about the final slide, which I'll run to now, about making change, how the issues are cultural. Oh, I've skipped past it. There we go. How these issues are primarily cultural. Can we expand on what might be needed to help make this shift? And this question has come from Ali, who works in visual communication. So they're really interested in finding ways to use these skills to change cultural perception, educate people, and raise awareness.
Great. So I'm only going to answer part of your question, Ali, because basically you preempted the kind of question we're going to go on to in the much more interactive part, which is coming up. So I don't want to give an answer now to that part, because I want to actually, let's get the group going, and I'll be part of that. In terms of sort of what these issues might be, it will be, so I'll just give a couple of examples. A very simple example, and I'm going to draw from personal experience here, because I know that, and I know that's only going to be moderately direct, but directly relevant to Man, but hopefully you'll understand where I'm coming from. My home city is gridlocked a lot of the time because the cultural approach has been, I want to drive my own vehicle to be in my own space, in terms of getting to and from work or whatever it is. Now, whether that's right or wrong, it has led to huge car ownership here, and up until recently, declining public transport use, which meant then the public transport provision dropped. So negative circle. And in order to move away from that, there needs to be a cultural shift from I want to be enclosed in my own safe space for travel to I maybe want to be active, or I'm willing and quite keen to take the public transport or whatever it is, because you can put the technology there, that you can put the equipment there, but unless people culturally want to make that decision, and it might be incentivized by money, it's not necessarily a solely cultural thing. There's definitely an economic part that is played as well, but nonetheless, unless the cultural shift is there, you can have all the most wonderful technology to reduce congestion, but it's not going to work. A similar example would be on consumption. So we, over the course of the latter part of the 20th century, we moved very rapidly into throw into a culture of consumption and throwing away, a linear consume, throw away, job done. And we're still relatively used to that. It's still very difficult for many people to feel that recycling is something that they want to do, want to be bothered to do, has any meaningful impact, or to even reuse things or to repair things for reuse. Obviously, part of it is about having the facilities available, but even then, it's about helping people decide that they do want to do that. They do want to put things out for recycling rather than chucking everything in the sack. And you can't force that on people. And that has really quite significant impact if that waste is then going to incineration or to landfill. Even if you're recovering energy from it, it's still generating greenhouse gases. So those are just two examples. There are many, many more, but we're going to get stuck into that question of how do you address it right now, I think.
Yeah, perfect. So we're now going to go into an open discussion. I would really encourage everyone to share as much as they can about things they've learned so far, and things you'd like to learn as well to really facilitate this culture change. To help this discussion along, we're going to use a mural board, which is an online sort of whiteboard. I'll share my screen and I'll also drop the link to the mural in the chat for everybody to join. There we go. If you click on that, you'll be able to come on in. Once a few people have joined, I will teach you how to use the mural.
So no online webinar would be complete without some sort of minor tech glitch. So we had hoped to break you into groups. That's not going to be possible. So we're going to have to operate as one big group, which we're going to do once Laura's introduced everybody into the mural. Looks like we've got a good number.
We've got a good number, so I'll start teaching you. So the key things of the mural are you can double click anywhere to add a post-it note like I've just done. You can type on it easily. To move around, you just click and drag to move yourself about. And then to zoom in, you want to scroll. So it's upward scroll to zoom in and it's downward scroll to zoom out. You can click and drag objects to move them as well. So if you've popped a note somewhere that you don't want it, then you can move it that way as well. Feel free to zoom in as much as you want because the text is visible at a really small scale when you zoom in. So don't worry about trying to take up too much room or too little room. The first activity is just to drop your favorite animal on the left-hand side here. So zoom into the left, make a sticky note. Mine is a wolf, so I'll pop that there. Once we've got a few animals, I will pass back to Alex, who will lead us in our discussion about culture change. I can see people are making notes, which is great. Super. A hawk, that's an interesting one.
Oh, and a critical function on this, if you go and do something you really didn't want to do, such as accidentally delete somebody else's thing, Control Z undoes what you've just done. So I've had to use that on many occasions, so you can backtrack.
Super. We've got some good animals. Thank you, everybody. I think we're familiar with how to use it now, so I'll pass to you, Alex, and we can do the first question.
Okay, so if you can move yourself onto that. Yeah, so the first question is about sort of what you think the challenge is. So what cultural shift or change is needed for meaningful climate action in your organization? You can expand that out if you want to maybe society more broadly. What I'm going to ask you to do is have a think about that. We'll probably spend 5 minutes or so just quietly type what you want to. So you don't need to think about having a conversation to start with. Type what you think there is, maybe, and start looking at what other people are putting down. And then once activity is dying down, we'll open up a conversation about it. If once you've typed something down, if you could put your name next to it, if you feel able to, unless you're being hugely controversial and you don't want to, it means that we can then invite you to maybe speak a little bit more about it and help the conversation flow. So yeah, please have a go at what your answer to this is. Pop your name on, and we'll start a discussion in 4 or 5 minutes once people have had a chance to put things down. Any questions, please shout, or if you're having trouble with the mural, again, please shout. Laura can provide expert guidance. Okay. Oh, we've still got one or two being added. So this is it, maybe last minute or so. So if you've got anything else to add, please do so. I see we don't have any names attached, so I'm just going to have to ask people to volunteer when the time comes. Okay. Laura, we've got your screen. I'm wondering, do you want to take us to one or two, and let's see if we can find out who's written them and see if we can learn a bit more, and we can take notes as we go.
Sure. So a reminder of the question: what cultural shift is needed for meaningful action on climate in your organization? Let's go to this blue one. A manufacturer and a high energy user having investment and payback opportunities are difficult to obtain. This brave soul would like to pop their mic on and claim.
It's mine. Can you hear me? It's Jane.
Yes, thanks, Jane.
Hello, Jane.
Hiya. So yeah, we're a manufacturer of metal products. So we use a lot of CNC machines, very high energy user, and the sort of the business that we work in, it's normally short payback considerations that are taken into account when you're looking at, maybe using green energy, having solar panels, and providing our own energy. It's difficult, and we're also owned by an American company, so their investment opportunities are slightly different than what we might want here.
Yeah, so you don't have complete control over everything, because you are owned by another organization which will have a particular perspective. Does that strike a chord with anybody else in this group? Do you feel that just inherently the operation of your business or the structure of your ownership has a massive limiting factor on what you can do?
I think as well, I've because I put the one about the waste on there as well. So I've come from working in a UK company where we've made huge savings, massive millions of pounds savings by backhauling and recycling our waste, just saving energy by looking at base load when branches are closed and things like that. It's not as easy on the Isle of Man, particularly around waste. You haven't got that cost incentive to want the business to want to change.
Yeah, so if it moves out of the cost realm,
yeah,
in terms of it really the decision making becomes much more challenging, doesn't it?
Yeah, it falls down the agenda, and that's the culture, isn't it? That's
mm-hmm.
or even the pain of making a change just to not have any saving at all is a difficult one.
Has anybody else in the group today experienced that, almost just the pain of making change being a limiting factor? Please don't be shy. It'd be good to hear your experiences.
If I could speak again, as soon as nobody else is speaking.
Yeah.
Somebody's actually put on there about the dependency on our own travel and driving our own cars to work. that's something that I've looked at from our business, and trying to do a car share scheme, which just fell completely flat because people didn't want to make that change. And like you said before, they want to drive their own cars, and they've always got a reason why they need to have their car there. So I don't know who's put that on, but it's very sort of similar problem than we've had.
Hi, that was me. My name's Helene. Yeah, that was more from a personal perspective than it was from my company's perspective. For me, myself, it's something that I'm obviously very aware about what we're doing as a family and what we're putting into the environment. But I have 3 children in 3 different places that need dropping off and picking up, as well as myself coming back and forth to work. And I don't see how I do that in terms of walking, public transport, car sharing. And it seems to be the biggest thing for me. I don't know if anyone else has got any experience on that.
Hi. Oh, sorry.
I was going to say, we have a hand up from Naomi, so please go, Naomi.
Yeah, hi, my name's Naomi Atkins. I work on the climate change transformation team with Fiona, and I just wanted to say that I absolutely have that situation myself. I've got 2 children, they have clubs, and it's a real source of a constant kind of trying to think of ways to get around it. And I think that, you know, that there is an appreciation of that when, you know, when we're looking at things like transport strategies and things. I think there is an awareness that it's having a car and having to make those journeys, the line between, you know, luxury, convenience and necessity is a little bit blurred sometimes. You know, so trying to put your finger on which you know, which type of travel is really essential. And I actually don't think we'll ever get away from cars fully, because of what you said, modern life is so kind of fast paced and there's so much to do. But I think there is an awareness of that at the kind of policy making level. So although that doesn't help you with your specific problem, I think it's reassuring to know that there isn't an assumption that everyone can just give up their cars and start walking their children everywhere.
That's good to know. I mean, one of the only kind of concepts we came up with as a family to sort of get around this is to change one of our vehicles for not fully electric but a hybrid, and to try and use that as much as possible rather than reliance on something petrol or diesel powered. But
yeah.
Obviously that then there's a flip side, because that involves quite a large capital outlay for us that we wouldn't necessarily have gone through. So it's very difficult. Not everyone's in that situation that they can do that.
Absolutely. And you know, the island, the way the island is kind of laid out as well, there's quite a lot of people who live quite rurally, and you know that walking just isn't an option for them. You know, to get to the nearest shop, they'd have to walk for miles and miles and miles. But yeah, I think from a personal perspective, trying to sort of like identify and plan things out has helped me a little bit. Sort of planning out journeys to coincide with each other, you know, trying to, I guess, just kind of trying to lump things in together, you know. I think a little bit of planning ahead has really, really helped me with that, with making fewer journeys.
No, Naomi, thank you.
Sorry, Tim here. I was just going to chip in a point about vehicle ownership and the fact that it is a cultural belief that everybody's entitled to own their own vehicles. And it's coming back to that last slide and the technology. There is technology coming that means autonomous vehicles could actually help to remove that need, even though we may need different types of transport. You know, it would be possible to not necessarily own vehicles, but still get backwards and forwards between the places that we need to get to without owning vehicles, and even in our own compartmentalized way if we chose to. But at the moment, I'm not sure that even the move to electric vehicles with the view to everybody owning one, if not 2 or more vehicles, is the correct way to go, and that would mean cultural and technology changes.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think electric vehicles are the answer to it all. They're not the kind of panacea, because obviously they do still have a footprint. So obviously, active travel, walking or taking public transport is always going to be preferable to those. But I can see a kind of combination of those solutions being present in the future.
So I think one of the things with this for me is how do you motivate people to make the changes that some things we are already empowered to do, but it might be too expensive to actually do it. So therefore, and if it's too expensive to do it, you couldn't legislate to enforce it, and so that's the nub of the problem for me. It's actually finding how you drive that change, and I don't have the answers for that, and it becomes very difficult. So even you couldn't legislate even for things like to insulate homes or insulate buildings, because there's the cost implications, and so everybody knows it's the right thing to do. Not everybody can afford it, and it's the same thing with businesses. And there's comments here on this board, how when you can map the changes that need to make into a cost saving or increased profit, then every business is right behind it. Getting the correct motivation and change is fine. As soon as it doesn't add up to a cost saving, you then, the survivability of the business trumps the change. And so you end up not making those changes. So, yeah.
Legislation's kind of my area, actually. So legislation, really banning things or forcing people to do things, is really the last option that anybody wants to take. And before that, obviously, you look to encourage people to make change, and then you kind of facilitate and help support them make change. So things like the Green Living Grant, for example, came out, and that's an example of helping to facilitate that change. But within your businesses, I think from a sort of personal perspective, I would say start small. Start with small changes, and I think having an understanding of the value of those changes outside of a monetary amount can be really useful. So someone else has put a post-it notes about education, I think it was, or awareness. Sorry, I can't quite see. Yeah, so I think in my previous roles, I've tried to make changes within businesses and met with quite a lot of resistance, even to quite small changes. One of the things like putting in a recycling system and things like that, one of the things that I found really useful was kind of creating a sense of ownership, which I did by kind of bringing people into the conversation about how we could make changes, and then once they feel as though I think the psychological thing is that if someone thinks something is their idea, they're way more likely to get on board with it.
That's a very, very interesting point, and that's touching on the next question, actually. So I think we've definitely discussed some of this. There's plenty more that could be discussed. I think touched on awareness, understanding about impacts on climate was one. I think there was one on changing farming practices. There's quite a few there which I'd like to explore, but I'd like us to move on to the next question, which is, how can we enable this shift in a Manx context as individuals, businesses, and whole communities? So I know we've already heard a little bit about that. So if you've come up with something, and maybe it is, we've had that discussion about, well, it's just got to financially make sense and then it will happen. But whatever you feel can be done or should be done or is necessary, if you can get that down here, we'll do the same as before, have 4 or 5 minutes of just getting ideas down. And we'll then open it out into a discussion. Okay, so last minute or two, and then we'll have a look at what everybody's come up with. Okay, great. If you have further ideas, please pop them up. As we discuss, I may well just add further things onto the mural as we go. So I think there are a number of things here. I could start anywhere. My eye is immediately drawn to the Albert Einstein quote, but maybe we'll come on to that in a minute. I think a couple down, maybe towards the bottom left, maybe an interesting place to start. So helping people to understand the value of change when it's not financial, but also helping people to understand the cost of not making change, even if not financial. I'm going to suspect that was the same person who wrote that. Does anybody want to elaborate a little bit further on this and what you think the impact might be of doing this?
Hi, that was me, Naomi.
Hello, Naomi.
Hi. Sorry, which one did you want me to?
either, because they're sort of they're both two sides of the same coin, aren't they?
Yeah, I guess so. I think it's going back to what was said earlier about there not being any kind of savings to be made. I think sometimes it can be useful to kind of really look at what you're trying to change and what value that can bring, rather than, even if it's not purely financial, or even if it might be financial but indirectly. So things like business reputation is something to think about, how your customers might see your business in a different light if you make changes to how, you know, to how you operate, you know, in the context of climate change and caring for the natural environment, and also changes to you know, wider aspects. So for example, if you change your supplier to a more ethical supplier, trying to, although there might be a slight cost increase to doing so, if you look at what's behind that and the value that brings to people, you know, the value that that might bring to shifting what you're purchasing from, maybe coming from somewhere that doesn't treat its employees well, you know, if you try and get that across to people, I think that people can see value even when it's not money. Does that make sense?
Well, it definitely makes sense as far as my understanding of it. I'd be interested to know what other people's experience of that is. Looking at the bottom line.
Yeah, I'm going to chip in just because it's quite. I think this is an interesting thing in that we have to drive change, and the easy steps when you can map change to commercial benefit to a company is straightforward, and beyond that it's hard. So motivating that and having some impact on your customer base is a very good way to do it. And we saw things with ISO standards is a good example of that. You know, if you look into things like quality or cybersecurity and that sort of thing, having your business with those accreditations when you in the market, it is, you know, kind of a direct impact on where people place their business, and that in itself then affects the bottom line, which motivates the business. So we had a question before about the ISO 14001. Yes, those things very definitely help you implement that within your business, but at the same time can be something that you can proudly stand behind later, and so that would help the change. And we talked, you mentioned, Alex, you know, something about a requirement to report emissions. I mean, there's a potential there, isn't there, in a way, from a legislative or an encouragement process that businesses would have to report that. And again, that then immediately changes the value to a business of their emissions, because it will directly hit the bottom line. So not making the change. So I think it is I do feel that we need to cross this barrier, and we haven't done it yet. In that lots has been done, but it's always driven by cost savings, and how we get over the next step is important. And whilst I agree with the point that legislating might be the last resort, I'm not so sure how you encourage the change, but I'm not an expert on that.
Thank you, Tim. Yeah, I think that you're definitely, I say you, I'm definitely witnessing many more organizations beginning to engage in this subject, because they are being asked to show what they're doing by their customers. And that definitely does have suddenly changes the way it's perceived as an issue. So that is one way of getting things to shift, and that's as a customer, as a business. So each of you as a business will be a customer to other organizations, suppliers, etc. So you actually have quite a bit of ability. You might be one of their smallest accounts, so probably not, in some cases not a lot, in others you might be massive for a supplier, and you have the ability to at least put it on their radar in a way that it wouldn't have been a year ago or 2 years ago. So you can actually have quite a bit of impact if it matters to you, and you want to be asking those questions, and at the same time you at some point might be on the receiving end of that. So there is the chance for that to grow and build. I wanted to, it's such a simple one, and I think it was put on here before. Somebody put down education, and I'm wondering if whoever put that down would be willing to explain and maybe elaborate a little bit, because there's an awful lot contained in one word there.
Hello, it's Rachel. I'm David's speaker.
Hello.
We put education down. We are farmers, so we come from Ballykelly Farm. And for us, the entire business is about either educating ourselves in better, processes we can do within our business. Educating, we sell our meats directly to the public, so educating our customers in what they're buying and why they should care, or how our practices are better, and so therefore you might have to pay more for our product and things like that. But also, like we were talking about, changing all the vehicles. You mentioned we can't just all change to electric. If last year we've purchased a whole load of diesel tractors or something like that. So it's educating ourselves in how we can do sort of business plans as to the best thing we can do for a 10-year change around. Yes, it might not fall in some deadline, but education is huge on sort of lots of levels for us.
I think that really interesting points there. I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more about how you go about educating your customers, because pretty much every organization here will have customers of some form. And educating the customer is an interesting dynamic.
For us, I think it has to start with the children, and I think there needs to be some big pushes on educating at the youngest level, because these are the guys that are going to bring it through. And so we quite often go into schools and discuss, why you should care where your food comes from and things like that. And I think education on this whole topic should be starting with the children, because they're the ones that are going to go home to the parents and maybe insist that they have our sausages, or they look at packaging and they start looking for different things on packaging, things like that. So for us, I do think obviously there's the push for education with we find a lot of the older generation actually are better to buying our products, because they get sort of the old-fashioned ways of why food was better when it's produced in the way we do. And there seems to be a bigger gap in the middle. And now the younger generations coming through are seeming to care more. I think my generation, I'm 40, they are probably one of the worst. And we seem to be the gap in the middle. But yeah, so the consumer is definitely, for us, ours is face-to-face mainly. But I do think for the island, we need to get in the education system.
And that's a really, really, really important point. Obviously, I think some of the other businesses here are quite different from a farming dynamic, but are there others of you in the group here today who have found themselves educating your customers, or could see that there might be a way for you to do so, which would then be beneficial for you in terms of increasing demand for your particular services or products because you have taken a more sustainable approach? Does anybody have had any experience with that, or is maybe looking to do that?
If I could speak, that's for me, that I've kind of placed my business in the eye of the storm, in that everything I do is supporting people who are trying to make a difference in the world. And that was a really brave decision to do that. And a lot of people said that it wouldn't be possible, you wouldn't make money. And I've made a living out of it, and it's actually become my USP. And not only that, but I think working with these issues just gives you so much more meaning and purpose as well, just in general in life, because you know you're making a difference. And I find it really fascinating how so many people say that they wish they could do that too. But why don't we? You know, why don't we take that leap and give it a go? So yeah, it's just something I'm really passionate about.
And Ali, how have you found demand for your business? How has that changed over time?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, even 10 years ago, climate change just wasn't in the consciousness. But it's such an issue now, and it really gives me hope. And I think working with so many brands out there, for example, that are really changing the way that we do business, and creating new systems for that, and valuing people and planet over profit, for example. It really gives me hope that there are amazing people out there doing amazing things, and it is possible. It's a case of, as we're saying, you know, education and taking the leap sometimes, I think.
Great. Thank you, Ali. I know quite a few people who started out with a very similar story to yours, which was, well, I thought I'd give it a go. I didn't know whether it's, lots of people said, oh, it won't work, but the demand for their services grew and grew and grew, and they were able to tell a story about it, a narrative. And I think somebody mentioned narrative down here, so shifting the narrative around these issues. So actually, as a business, you can create a narrative about what you're doing, which can be very powerful, not for all consumers. Some consumers really won't care, but some will care a lot, and that narrative can have a real impact on driving business to you, especially if you can make that really clearly. We're almost out of time, but I did want to ask very briefly if somebody wanted to explain the Albert Einstein quote, which is towards the top right. You cannot solve a problem at the level of consciousness that created it. It's one of the ones I very much appreciate. I don't know who put it up, if you'd be willing to explain why you popped it up.
That was me again. Yeah, I love that quote. I put it in there to be a little bit provocative, but I think it's such a powerful one. I think we kind of culturally quite often focus on, you know, the kind of the symptoms and not the root cause of things. And for me, this is so much the root cause of all of these issues, is really shifting our paradigm and our way of thinking. And that's why I loved how you're talking about culture before. It is a cultural issue, isn't it? So that's kind of joined a few pieces in my mind together, which I'm really grateful for. But I mean, I'd love to hear your take on it as well, Alex.
Oh, and we're just ticking over to the ending time. We could probably talk about this for quite a while. And I think, I think the way you've described it is really pertinent for me. Having worked in one form or another in this field for years and years, it very much is driven by people's worldview, what matters to them and what doesn't matter to them. And there will always be things that are in that. So people and businesses, we need to make ends meet. We need to make sure that there's enough money coming in to pay the bills and to keep ourselves warm and well fed. But there is the need for the shift to look beyond that, so that it's not the only measure by which we make decisions in the way that it has been before. And making those decisions is pretty tricky, because actually a lot of climate issues are not tangible to us in the day-to-day. There's some very easily calculated numbers, but those numbers are not as motivating as seeing something actually happening. So our farmers here today will probably be seeing the changes much more readily and able to use that to aid their decision making. most of us who don't have that same engagement with the cycles of the climate, of the land, don't have that immediate stimulus, which then say this is the really important part of decision making. So, so for me, the education point is, I think, really important. The more people can actually engage with the lands, with the weather, with all of the things that are shifting and changing, the more people will then take that and use that to make decisions, whether it's a tiny personal decision or a big corporate decision. So shifting how we perceive things for me is absolutely critical, because ultimately at the big boardroom of a massive FTSE 100 company here in the UK, those decisions are made by people, and those people have all sorts of things that are vying for their attention in decision making. But if they have experience of what's going on, or have this awareness of what's going on, they might make a different decision. And that's not to destroy their business necessarily, but to take quite a different direction. So for me, it's really critical. I'd love to talk longer, Ali, but I've now very much run into Fiona's end time. So I'm going to call a halt to myself right there. Thank you very much, everybody, for participating. I'm sure if we were in a room together, we could have gone much further, much deeper, had a proper chat, but thank you for contributing to this virtual attempt at a discussion. So now all it takes from me is to pass over to Fiona to finish up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. I'm just going to quickly share my screen for this last slide. Yeah, thank you so much for all your input into that kind of interactive session. Just in terms of, I felt I went very quickly through the kind of local context. So if you do want any more information about climate change in the Isle of Man, there's my contact details there, and Ali Lewin, my colleague, who's leads the delivery of the current climate change plan, and I'm on the policy development and the bill side of things. So do get in touch if you have any specific questions or the things that we talked about today that you'd like more of the Manx context on. I must just do a really quick advert for the amazing programme of events that Ali and Rose, my colleagues, have put together for this fortnight around COP26. So please do go to the website and look at what's on and attend one of those events. There's an awful lot happening. So yeah, must promote that. But I suppose that my biggest thank you is just, thank you for all the inspiring stories that you've fed into this very short session. It's been so, brilliant to hear about what Manx businesses are already doing around climate change and the culture change as well. So, it's been brilliant to hear that. It's so great to see the support for the UNESCO Biosphere Isle of Man, and also for Net Zero Isle of Man. I must say a really big thank you to Joe and Rebecca for just putting together such an amazing series that we've been able to be part of, and then particularly obviously to Alex, who's done so much around this, and Laura and Naomi for their work that they've done on this. But I'll hand back to Rebecca, I think, at the end. But it's been so good to hear so many positive things, and I hope that you have found it useful as well.
Wow, thank you so much, everyone. What an amazing couple of hours. It's amazing what we can achieve online, isn't it, really? So delighted to be joined by Alex and Laura. Thank you so much. And always thank you to Fiona as well for your input. I'll do a full follow-up with you. I'll chat with Alex, Laura and Fiona offline in terms of what we can share as a follow-up. And just once again, thank you very much, everyone, for attending.